Today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Mem Daled. The dapim for, if you didn't already get the links for them, the dapim for Shabbat and Chag, or Chag and Shabbat, Mem Vav and Mem Zayin are already up on the site, 46 and 47. If you didn't get the link, you could just find them either by using the drop-down menu of finding dapim. You could just look up Yevamot Daf 46 and 47, and you'll be able to find them. There's also a search button on the website. You can always just type in whatever page you're looking for, and assuming you spelled it correctly, then you'll be able to find it. Okay, we're going to start with the Mishnah on the bottom of Mem Gimel, a bit of a simpler daf today. 100% simple, but definitely a little easier than some of the earlier ones. Starting with the Mishnah, Arba'a Achim. So we're starting 5 lines from the bottom of Mem Gimel on the bet. Arba'a Achim, Nisuim Arba Nashim V'Metu. There's also a sheet for today, which only starts from not this Mishnah, but the next Mishnah at the bottom of Amud Aleph of Mem Dalet. So 4 brothers. Nisuin arba nashim. So they're married to 4 women, v'metu, and they die. Im ratzah hagadol shebehem liyabem et kulana reshup yado. This sounds like a bit of a strange Mishnah. If the oldest one among them wants to do yibum with all the women, he can. Didn't they all just die? What are we talking about? An oldest one, the Gemara is going to obviously explain. We mean there were more than 4 brothers. Okay, there were 5, 6, 7 brothers. We don't know how many. Some of them died without children, and then now comes a bit of a, if you didn't think that was strange, how could they have done Yibum if they were dead? Well, we resolved that. But what happens now? We're now going to have the oldest one, if he wants, can go do Yibum with 4 women. That would be a little bit insane. But that's what the Mishnah says. No problem. He can go marry 4 women. Okay, the Gemara is going to raise some possible issues here. Mishayat. Now, this next line of the Mishnah is also strange, but not in terms of the content of it. But it's strange because you would have expected this to be probably in the first Mishnah of Yevamot, okay? Because this is an incredibly basic law, and it's very odd that we're only getting to this now in the middle of chapter 4. Okay, we discussed this when we started the Masechet, but the Mishnah the Masechet starts off kind of in the middle, like they assume, there's Yibum. Remember the 15 cases where not only the wife is exempt, right, because she's Erba, but the Tzara is exempt and the Tzara is exempt, right? It assumes all sorts of things, and what it really assumes is what it says in our Mishnah, which is Mishaya, and so much of what we learned already is predicated on this, that it seems really odd that the Mishnah only mentions it now. At the time we talked about it, that this happens sometimes, the beginning of Masechto, they often start out in the middle of something, like we gave an example of Masechet Makot, where it starts off really in the middle, where it says basically that, when don't the Edib Zomimim get the punishment that they tried to do to the person who they lied about, and it gives the exception to the rule rather than the rule. And there actually it's the 4th Mishnah has the basic rules of Edim Zomimim, which is the main topic of that chapter. So here also, right, it's not in the 4th Mishnah, it's actually in the 4th chapter where we only get to hearing about this. So Mishayana soy l'shtei nashim v'met, if you were married to 2 women and you died, biata o chalitzata shelacha mehem poteret tzakata, either having sexual relations with one of them, which is Yibum, or doing chalitza to one of them exempts the other, right? Meaning only one of them needs to do Yibum or chalitza. The Gemara is going to raise all sorts of questions here, which we've kind of raised in the past. We're going to raise them again and answer, why don't you do it with both? And where do we get this from? And all that, which again is very basic to the Masechet, very strange. It comes up only here. I don't have an answer for this, by the way. I'm just kind of raising it as an issue. I'm going to actually do some research. I seem to remember that those are not the only 2 Masechtot where it happens. I think it happens often in other Masechtot as well. I'll go back and remember what those are. Okay, even I'm just thinking out loud, right? Megillah Nikret, right? The beginning of Megillah. It's read on all these different days. It's already talking about the exceptions, right? Talks about when can it possibly be read when it's not the days it's supposed to be read, without talking about there's a Chiyuv Megillah, without talking about, right? Even Me'matai Korin Shema Ba'al Ravin, right? It's almost as if certain things. Okay, so I see you're all writing things as I'm saying them. So exactly. So there's a lot of examples like this. Again, we're coming at from a perspective of how we would write a book, right? It's not necessarily the perspective of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi when he wrote it. So it's a good study to kind of see what other Masechtot start off with exceptions to the rule. There's another line of the Mishnah that we've already, right? Because we're now in the middle of the Masechet, we've already quoted, well, not the middle yet, but we're already well into it. We're quoting all sorts of Mishnah which were quoted previously. If one was kshera and one was psula, one, right, he has two wives, and one, we're going to have to see what does this mean. If he decided to do chalitza, do it to the one who's already disqualified. If he decided to do yibum, we should do it to the one who was kshera, who was, well, we don't know what this means, but if you remember, we already learned, what does this mean? This means that if one of them was already divorced beforehand, meaning she couldn't marry a Kohen anyway, so if he's going to do chalitza, he should do chalitza to that woman, because otherwise he's going to mess up a woman who's not forbidden to a Kohen. He's now going to make her forbidden to a Kohen by doing chalitza. So if you're going to do chalitza, do it to the one who's already disqualified from marrying a Kohen. And if you want to do yibum, you can do it. Now, here it's either one, but in that case, you can do it to the kshera because you're not messing her up at all. You're actually marrying her, so it's totally fine. So the Gemara is going to start off with our first case. Arba'a achim sakadatach. What's this arba'a achim? There's four brothers. Why? It sounds like there's only four brothers and they all died. Ela ema arba'a me'achim. What we mean is four of more brothers. It's not a case, right? Often we had in the Mishnah, there's three brothers and two are married to sisters and one is married to someone else. And we talked about all the brothers that were there. Here, they're not mentioning all the brothers. They mentioned one of the brothers, right? Four of the brothers, but there's actually obviously more. Harishut biyado. So now we're going to talk about, wait, if this one brother wants to marry all four wives, we really let him. But Vishav Kele, we let him do this? Hatanya, doesn't it say in the Braita? Quoting from the verses of the Torah, the Karulo Ziknei Iro. Okay, it says the Zkinim of a city, the elders call him. It's a very strange pasuk. It says Vidibru Elav, and they speak to him. What's the problem? It doesn't say what they say to him. And then it says Va'amar, if after speaking to them, he stands up and he says, Lo chafasi lekachta, I wish not to marry her. I'd rather do chalitza, right? Then we go through the chalitza ceremony. So the question is, what did they say to him that caused him to say, right? Almost sounds like something they said caused him to decide, let me do chalitza. So first thing they darshan is the karula ziknei ro, which means who's supposed to speak to him? The zkenim themselves. Hein velo shluchan. They don't send representatives. They do it themselves. Dibru elav, what did they say? Melamed shemasiim lo itzahu genelo. Means that they look at the person in front of them and they look at the Yevamot and who he's supposed to marry, and they give him advice that's appropriate to this particular person. Like, for instance, She'im hayahu yeled, he was young and she was old. Hu zaken v'hi yalda, he's very old and she's very young. Omrim lo, ma lecha etzel yalda, ma lecha etzel zkena, kalech etzel shkemotcha. What are you doing? You're going to marry this woman who's so much younger than you. You're going to marry this woman who's so much older than you. You should find women that are more your age range. And don't create a situation of strife in your house. Okay, this could be number one, right? If you are older and you have an older wife, and then you're going to bring in this very young wife into the house, one can imagine that would cause problems. Or you bring in an older woman into the house, it would be very odd. Or maybe just saying, if there's such a huge age gap, it's going to create strife between you and the woman you're doing yibum with, right? And they basically say, find, right? In this case, you're better off doing chalitza, okay? Not to say that an older man can marry a younger woman or vice versa, right? We know it happens, and we know, it could be very happy marriage, but often, right? It's not most often the case. People do marry people generally around their age range, and therefore they say, this might not be the best idea. So likewise, if four women fall to Yibum Tim, you would think that this Kenim would say, this isn't maybe the smartest thing. Right now, the Gemara is assuming that we're talking about not smart from a financial perspective, because how are you going to support four wives, right? That means four wives, their kids, their families. That's a lot of people to support. So it must be a case where he could afford it. Okay, we've neutralized the financial issue, because otherwise, how could that be? So they say, well, if finances aren't an issue, right? Because remember, husband has a financial obligation. He's got to write a ketubah to each of them, commit to them money, clothing, okay, and all sorts of things. We'll talk about what else in a minute. But right now, we're assuming financial. And in the event of death or divorce, it's going to have to give them all money. That's a lot of money. So they say, well, if he's got the funds, why did they specifically say four? They're assuming here four and no more. Why no more? So they say, Eitzah tova kamashvalan. Arba'in tfelo, keheche dinim tie ona b'chodesh. What they're saying is the Mishnah is telling you what's Eitzah Tova, which means this is good advice not to take any more than 4, even if you can financially afford it, because it's not just about the finances. It's about the fact that you have an obligation to your wife to be with your wife, to have sexual relations now, we'll talk about this mitzvah of Ona. It's called the mitzvah of Ona. It's one of the things that a husband commits to a wife in the ketubah, in addition to financial, which is that so it could be understood in different ways. Either her time of the month, you should be with her, right? Again, to have children and all that. But it's actually a fascinating thing. It's basically when she's interested in having sexual relations, right? For all who say the perspective is often on the men, this is a very interesting perspective on women, especially, I would say it was a bit modern thinking of the rabbis in those days, to say that the husband is obligated toward the wife. When she's interested, he has to give that to her. So now, if you have 4 wives, you're obviously going to have a bit of a problem. You're not going to get to each wife very often. And this is based on another Gemara, which talks about interesting, the rabbis talked about this. How many times a week or a month is a man supposed to have relations with his wife? So there's a whole thing about, depending on who you are, what your job is, how many times. So we'll get to this Gemara. I don't remember where it comes up, but one of the things is about a Talmid Chacham is supposed to have relations once a week. So the assumption here, the perspective is really on the man. So if he's supposed to have relations once a week, it's almost like he shouldn't have relations with a woman more than once a week. So basically, if we want him to at least get to each wife once a month, so that would be perfect. If you have 4 wives, you can get to each of them once a month. This would obviously assume you didn't have any other wives already, right? And therefore, we're going to say, don't do more than 4, because it's not just the finances that are the issue. It's the finding time for each of them at least once a month. Okay. So, by the way, some commentaries say if you're in the category of people who it's appropriate to have sexual relations twice a week, then you can actually marry 8 women, because then you can get to each one once a month. Anyway, wouldn't recommend it, but they do. Some of the commentaries do point that out. Right? It's a mathematical game. Okay, Mishaya Nasui. Now we get to the second part. So we've resolved this 4 brothers, right, who all die. One brother can potentially marry all 4 women. Again, maybe this, even though we've come up with a way that it could be recommended, right? Does seem like the rabbis are discouraging this kind of thing and saying this might not be the best move to marry all 4 women, even though technically speaking, you can if you can financially afford it and you can get to each of them. But again, it's a little bit odd. Okay, next. Mishayana soy. So now we get to this issue of if you have 2 wives and you die without children, only one does yibum or chalitza and the other one doesn't need to. So now the Gemara suggests, and this again is suggesting things that we know are not the case, but they're raising all sorts of possibilities. And some of this is a repeat of sugya we've seen before. Why doesn't he do yibum with both? That would be fine. So, or maybe. So, right, maybe you would think each wife needs yibum. So, Rabbi Shiur bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Ka. So they say, right, he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he says, the pasuk says, Asher lo yivneh et beit achiv. Because you didn't build your brother's house. The whole goal is to build your brother's house. Notice bayit, house is singular. So from there they learn bayit echad boneh ve'ein boneh shnei batim. You're supposed to rebuild one house, not 2 houses. So only one wife, not both. Why don't we do chalitza to both though? Like we could try that. Maybe yibum not, but maybe chalitza you could do to both. Amar Marzutra bar Tuv Yamaka. So a different person brings a pasuk. Beit Chalutz Hanal. Also by Chalitza, it says they call him the Beit Chalutz Hanal, the house of the one who did the Chalitza of the shoe. Beit Echad Uchaletz, again, singular, house. Okay, he's the house of the one who did Chalitza. Ve'en Choletz Shnei Batim. Okay, therefore you see Chalitza is done to one person, not to 2. So we now have Yibum is done to 1, Chalitza is done to 1. You would think we would end at this point, but what do we say? Uniyabem lechada v'nichlotz lechada. Well, if we have singular by yibum and singular by chalitza, you could still say maybe you do yibum with one and chalitza with the other. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, im lo yachpotz. If he doesn't wish to do yibum, he does chalitza. Now, we've seen this a number of times. Ha-chafetz, if he wanted to, you could see from here, yibim, he could do yibum. Kol ha'oleh yibim, from there, what do we learn? Anyone who could potentially do yibum, oleh lechalitza. Because she'ein oleh yibum, ein oleh lechalitza, right? If you can do yibum, you can do chalitza. If you can't do yibum, you can't do chalitza. And therefore, if only one can do yibum, then we don't suggest doing chalitza by the other because the other can't do chalitza, can't do yibum. So obviously, you don't do chalitza with her. Ve'od, and similarly, or furthermore, I should say, Second issue is we don't want people to say that you do chalitza with one and yibum with the other. So the Gemara said, this is a very strange thing. We're saying don't do yibum with one and chalitza with the other, even though technically you could have. Now, why could you have? Even if you're not obligated in yibum, at least, what do we always say? Chalitza could just be a meaningless act. It's not, if you're not obligated in chalitza, so you just do chalitza. What's the harm, right? There's no harm done, although there is harm done. But, number one, she can't marry a Kohen anymore. But basically, if you want to be on the safe side, let's say, so maybe you should do chalitza to the second. But we're worried that people will say that you have to do yibum and chalitza if you have two wives. So the Gemara says, v'yomru, so what? People say that. Okay, so people will do yibum with one, chalitza with the other, no harm done. So what's the difference if people misunderstand? So they say, well, you're right that there's no harm done as long as you do the order properly. You do yibum first, and then you do chalitza. But idim eladilma chalitz v'hadran miyabim v'kam le below yivneh. But maybe someone will think that you could do yibum and chalitza, right? Yibum with one, chalitza with the other. But then what will happen? You might switch the order, and the order is critical because if you do chalitza with the first one, what's going to happen? You can't do yibum with the second one. We already learned that. Remember, there's a machloket. Is it isur lav because asher lo yivneh? Since he didn't build the house, he now can't build a house with any of the others, and it's an isur lav. Some people say it reverts back to isur eshet achiv, right? That she's the wife of his brother, and it's karet. So either which way, you can't do it in that order, and therefore don't do yibum to one and chalitza to the other, because people might think that you have to do it, and they might switch the order, and switching the order would be a critical mistake. So ve'ema, so now they suggest one more thing. Okay, since we now say that you have to do yibum and you have to do chalitza, and since you only do yibum for one and you only do chalitza to one, right? And we said, well, it's not like you do yibum and chalitza to each, but maybe since everything's in the singular form, maybe you would come to this conclusion. Again, these are all just raising all sorts of interesting possibilities. Maybe if you have one wife, kicks in the yibum obligation. But maybe if you have two wives and there's two batim, two houses and you can't do two houses, so maybe you wouldn't do yibum at all. Maybe you're exempt from yibum, right? Which again would be ridiculous to say at this point in the Masechet, because we obviously know that you do yibum when you have many wives, and that's what the Gemara is going to kind of answer. So they say, if you want to say that would be a ridiculous thing based on not only what we learned in the Mishnayot, but what it says in the Torah, or a drasha from the Torah, because if you remember, we started our Masechet with, how do we know that in a case where the woman is erva, the tzara is exempt? Remember, if the woman can't marry the yabam because let's say it's her father, so the tzara is exempt. Where do we learn that from? From a pasuk in the Torah. Right? Isha elachota lo tikach litzror legalot ervata aleha. So the litzror came to say the tzara is exempt as well. Now, if two wives never were obligated in yibum, you wouldn't need a special pasuk to teach you that tzara is exempt. So that's what they're saying now. Imken tzarat erva de'asar rachman alamali. Why do we need a pasuk to teach you that tzara of the erva is exempt? Hash detarte ba'alma amrat la b'nei chalitzo yibum yenu tzarat erva mebaya. If two wives are never obligated in yibum, then you wouldn't need a pasuk to exempt the second wife. So the Gemara has a good answer, which is alama lo. Why not? Actually, you would still. Why? Istrich, you would need it. Why? You might have thought erva abarai kaima. In this case where one of the wives is, let's say it's her father, and she's erva, what happens at that point? She is abarai. What is barai? Bar always means outside, like a braita. It's outside, or a wild animal is a chay bar, right? A chayaba. How's it coming? Chayot bar, right? Wild animals. So what do you say? She's on the outs at that point because she can't, if there's two wives, normally we'd say there's no yibum. But in this case, one of the wives has disappeared. She's kind of out of the picture because she's erva. So maybe you would look at that case as if you only had one wife. And that's why you need the pasuk to teach you. Right? So, v'tityabim sarata, you might have thought, in that case, you would do yibum because it's only one wife there. Kamash malan de asira. Therefore, the pasuk needs to come and tell you it's a sur. So that's not a good question. So in the end, you say, how do we really know that yibum anyway applies when there's two wives? Because at this point, we could have still proven that not. Because ele yivimto riba. It says yivimto in the pasuk twice. that comes to teach you even when there's 2 Yevamot. Okay? Because one of those Yevamot is unnecessary. You didn't need to say that. You already taught you about Yevamot. The subject was Yevamot. Why do you have to say his Yevamah? So from there, they learn it's time that even 2 Yevamot. And again, this is something that was quite obvious, but the Gemara kind of threw it up in the air as well. Right, we're now going back to that last line in the Mishnah. Rav Yosef, Kanshana, Rebbe, here Rebbe taught us, Lo yishpoch adam me'boro v'acherim tzrichim lahem. Remember, this is good advice that you can learn from here, which is don't throw out your dirty water when somebody actually might need it, right? All of those who did spring cleaning, right? And you maybe threw things in the garbage that maybe other people could use, right? It's a good example of don't throw things away. You might think it's garbage, but other people might actually want it. So again, don't do chalitza to your wife and then mess her up that someone else might, right? You don't want to marry her, but somebody else might want to marry her and you're going to now forbid her. If you do chalitza to her, then the Kohen won't be able to marry. You think, interesting, you're saying Meiboro is extra water than dirty. I think it's actually dirty water. That's the way I understood it. Because your Meibor, that's the way I understood it. But could be just extra. Okay, Mishnah. Hamachzir grushato. Okay, before we learn this Mishnah, actually, I want to learn a Mishnah that's on Memtet. This will kind of be basics for the basis for a bunch of things we're going to see later, which is, there's a Mishnah on Mem Tet Aleph. I brought it on the sheet, so you can either open in the Gemara or open on the sheet if you're looking at it, which is, it's at the top of the sheet because the sheet only starts with this Mishnah. Ezehu mamzer. Okay, I quoted first our Mishnah, but then I skipped down to the Yevamot Mem Tet. Ezehu mamzer. So Rabbi Akiva says, Kol sha'ar basal hu belo yavo. Any woman who you're not allowed to marry, right? Lo means a regular lo taseh. If you remember, Rabbi Akiva has this extreme position. Even chai ve'lavim are mamzerim. Okay, so if the Torah says don't marry this person, okay, as opposed to ones that are karet or ones you get death penalty by the court, those are much more severe. But Rabbi Akiva says even something less severe is going to be vlad mamzer. Okay, and we'll see cases of that in our Mishnah. Shimon Atimni says if you're chayav karet b'dei shamayim, then okay, only when there's karet. That's what we've been going by generally. Karet, if it's forbidden by karet, the kid's mamzer. And we pass it like Rabbi Shimon Atimni. It even says so in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua says, Rabbi Yeshua says it's when there's death by the hands of the court, not kritut and not lavim. Okay, they each have their own unique position. So with that, we're going to read the Mishnah. Hamachzir grushato, someone who divorced a woman, she married someone else in the interim, and now he remarries her, which is forbidden. So that's an isur lav. Hanoseh chalutzato, if he marries the woman he did chalitza with. Also Isur Lav, because Asher Lo Yivneh, because he didn't build his brother's house, he's not allowed to anymore, so he can't marry her. Vanosei krovat chalutzato, and if he marries any relatives of the chalutza. Now this is a bit of a problem, this line, and we're going to have a big issue with it in the Gemara. Why is it an issue? Because in a second we're going to say, let's just read, and then you'll see why it's a problem. Yotzi v'havlav mamzer. You are number one, if you did marry this kind of woman, you have to divorce her, and the child is a mamzer. What's the problem? Krovat chalutzato, if you remember, is all, we learned this, right? That any relative of the woman you did chalitza to is forbidden because it's as if you married her, even though you didn't. We're going to treat it like a divorcee. Remember, the rabbis were strict and said so that we don't come and think that once you divorce a woman, all of her relatives are permitted to you because it's not true. Okay, therefore, we're going to forbid all the relatives of chalutza as well. That's only rabbinic. Now, for Rabbi Akiva to come say a rabbinic decree, right, is going to cause mamzerim would be very strange. So we're going to have to, that's going to be our big question of the Gemara here. So that's all divrei Rabbi Akiva. Chachamim omrim, and a vlad mamzer. Vlad is not a mamzer. Modim, they agree to what though? B'nosei krovat grushato shavlad mamzer. The only one they agree with, even though this wasn't mentioned before, you would have thought it would have been mentioned before. We're going to get back to this. But they agree with an oseh, someone who marries the relative of a grusha, of a divorcee, the vlad will be a mamzer. Okay, why is that? Because that's already the relatives of your grusha. That means any relatives are forbidden by Torah law. Those are all karet. Okay, like her mother, right, her sister, all those are karet. So those are going to be, the vlad is going to be a mamzer. Why he didn't simply say any chayve kritut he agreed with, right? That could have been, and why he's referring to something that wasn't one of the cases that Rabbi Akiva mentioned. It seems weird because Modim would be, I agree with you about one of the things you mentioned. Anyway, we'll get back to all this. So here comes our big question. Gemara starts off, the Savar Rabbi Akiva nosei krovat chalutzato vlad mamzer. Rabbi Akiva thinks that if you marry the relative of your chalutza, the vlad is a mamzer. V'ha'amar Rish Lakish, didn't Rish Lakish say, kan shana Rebbe? This is where Rebbe taught. Achok grushami divrei Torah, achok chalutzami divrei sofrim. By the way, I want to point out just something. This kan shana Rebbe appeared also at the very end of, just before the Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef said, kan shana Rebbe lo yishpoch adam borov achirim tzruchin lo. It's interesting, kind of unique. I didn't get to look. I wanted to look at all the places in the Gemara where it says kan shana Rebbe. Right? It's a little bit weird. It comes up a lot here because we keep re-quoting this Rish Lakish one about this is where Rebbe said that the relative of your grusha is going to be B'Toraita, by Torah law, and the relative of your chalutza is by rabbinic law. These are two very different kan shana Rebbe. The other one was, you could take a moral lesson out of this, right? And this one is sort of just details about it, but it's an interesting just to note that there's a similar language here. So now, what do they answer? Right? If it's midivrei sofrim, if it's only by rabbinic law, how can the vlad be a mamzer? Tane krovat grushato. Change the wording. Okay, we've had this a lot recently. We're going to have it more today's daf. Change the wording of the Mishnah. Meaning, when it says hamachzir grushato v'anavsei chalutzato v'anavsei krovat chalutzato, it shouldn't be krovat chalutzato. It should be anavsei krovat grushato, which is by Torah law. The relative of a divorcee, that would be by Torah law. Now they're going to try to prove it. And then they're going to struggle with, is this a good proof or not? Okay. Hachinami mistabra. We can prove it further from the language of the Mishnah that really you have to change it to grushato. Because the Katani Seifa, when it says, and this is why I pointed it out before when we read the Mishnah, Modim minosei krovat grushato shavlav mamzer, they agree in that case, sounds like they're referring to something mentioned previously. If you stick in instead of krovat chalutzato, krovat grushato, when the rabbis come at the end of the Mishnah, they say, well, we agree with you about that one out of the three. It makes sense they're referring to something that was mentioned previously. So if really they were referring to it, right, that it was mentioned earlier in the Mishnah, grusha case, the relatives of the divorcee, hainu dekatani umodim. That's why they say, and we agree with you about that. But if they weren't referring to that before, then my modim, what? We agree with you about that, but that was never mentioned. It would be very strange. So they say, no, not necessarily. That's not a good proof. Dilma hakamashmala, maybe you read the Mishnah the way we read it originally, which was tiyesh mamzer mechayve kritu. What they were basically trying to say is, I don't agree with you about all the cases you mentioned, but I will agree with you when it comes to chayve kritu, right? If you're chayv karet for something, then the vla would be a mamzer. So they say, if they were just trying to point out chayve kritu, then hakatani lakaman. That's already mentioned further on in the Mishnah Memtet, the chayve kritut. In other words, if you're trying to say, we don't agree with you about chayve lavim, we only think chayve kritut, that's the topic of the Mishnah Memtet. We wouldn't need to say it here. Ezu mamzer, it says there. What's a mamzer? Kol she'er basal, shu below yavo, divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon HaTimni omer, kol shchayvim alav karei bidei shamayim, v'alacha kedvarav. There's Rabbi Shimon HaTimni, which is obviously chachamim in our Mishnah, and therefore, it's obvious. You wouldn't need to say it here. So, Vidilma Kasa Tamlan Tana Rabbi Shimon HaTimni. No, maybe again, if you say there's no point for that to say chayve kritu, then specifically they're talking about the grusha case, and then it would seem to be referring to something previously, and that would then prove the new reading of the Mishnah. But the Gemara says, no, maybe the Mishnah is trying to tell you we want to bring Rabbi Shimon HaTimni's opinion here as a stam opinion, as the rabbis, as the general, so that you know that we hold like him. So im came, litni shachayve kritu. But then, right, krovat grushato lamali, but then it makes no sense. Second question on this, it makes no sense that he would just say krovat grushato. If he was trying to say chayve kritu, why would he bring an example? He should just say the whole category. I agree with you when it comes to chayve kritu, it will be mamzer, but not chayve lavin. It would be weird that he would pick a particular case. So the Gemara said, right, and therefore they say, it must be that the beginning was talking about krovat grushato, which again resolves our question against Rabbi Akiva, and therefore they're referring back to a case that was mentioned previously. Because if really it was just trying to say chayve kritu, it was trying to say we hold the Rabbi Shimon HaTimni, it would have said chayve kritu. It wouldn't have given a specific case. But the Gemara rejects this because this Gemara says no, dilma la'olam lo ayriba. V'aytan machzir grushato v'nosei chalutzato ukrovat chalutzato. Taninami krovat grushato. Maybe your reading is wrong. It didn't say krovat grushato in the beginning. It was really krovat chalutzato. In which case, why did he say machzir grushato? Why did he say krovat grushato at the end? That we agree with you about that case. Because Rabbi Akiva brought case A, B, and C, and they say we don't agree with you about A, B, and C, but we agree about a case, for example, like D. Okay, it could be, and as they were talking in specifics, so we'll talk in specifics also. So we're back to square one. Ella, krovat chalutza told Rabbi Akiva have a mamzer, but how could you say that the krovav of the relative of a chalutza is a mamzer when it's only rabbinic? So we're now going to learn that according to Rabbi Akiva, it's actually a Torah law. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hainu tamet Rabbi Akiva, Damar Kla, Beit Chalutz Hanal. It says in the pasuk, the house of the one who did chalitza. We saw the pasuk before. Hakatuv pra'o beito. Remember, right? If you're the house of the chalutz hanal, that means you basically what they're saying. House is usually a reference to the wife because she kind of represents the house. So it means that your connection to the woman was like one of a house, even though you divorced, right? You did chalitza, you undid, but undoing means there has to have been something. This, by the way, would be a good support for Zika being significant because it means you were kind of married to her while the time what she was supposed to do even with you. When you do chalitza, you kind of remove that attachment, and therefore you're basically considered, all her relatives are going to be forbidden to you, and that's a Torah law, and that's why Rabbi Akiva thinks that the children are mamzerim. Now we're going to get to something that's going to take us till almost the end of the daf. Amar Rav Yosef, and it's going to be again possibly amending the text, but this time it's not a text of a Tanaitic source, it's a text of what Rav Yosef said. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. So Rav Yosef quoted something in the name of Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe. Hakol modim b'machzir grushato shavlab pagum l'kiuna. We've been talking until now about children born of problematic unions. So what we had was that Rabbi Akiva holds the vlad is a mamzer, even if it's isur lav. We have Rabbi Shimon Atimni who said it's not mamzer if it's isur lav. So now comes Rav Yosef and he says, everyone agrees, though, that if you return a grusha, right, like an isur lav, you're not supposed to marry her again, that the vlad is pagum l'kiuna. The vlad might not be a mamzer according to everyone, but the vlad can't marry a kohen. Okay, a kohen can't marry someone from that kind of relationship. So man hakomodim, who is this? Everybody agrees. Shimon Atimni, it must be Shimon Atimni. Da'af agav da'amach Shimon Atimni, ein mamzer mechai velavim, nihid mamzer lo have pagum miahav. Right, so now we're going to say that Rabbi Shimon Atimni, you said the vlad isn't a mamzer. However, right, there's different levels of people who can't marry. So mamzerim can't marry anyone other than mamzerim and people, right, who can't really marry other people. But this child can't marry a kohen. So now, where are we going to learn this from? We're going to learn it from a widow. A widow can't marry the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. So now, what happens if she does? So two things happen. Number one, she becomes what's called a halala. She can no longer marry a Kohen. So if she marries a Kohen Gadol and he dies, so she's not a divorcee, she's only a widow. Widows can marry regular Kohanim, but this widow cannot because she did an improper marriage with another Kohen. That disqualifies her from marrying a regular Kohen. Number two, her son or daughter is considered a halal or a halala. So if it's a daughter, she can't marry a Kohen either. If it's a son, then he can't, right? And both of them, by the way, can't eat truma. And he can't, by the way, this almanach can't eat truma. And the son can't be a Kohen and work in the temple. Okay, they're basically disqualified. So now they're going to say the following. Ma almanah lekohen gadol she'ein isura shava b'kol. We've seen this before. Her thing is only forbidden to a particular, in fact, in one case, it's one individual, just the Kohen Gadol. She can't marry Kohen Gadol. So, and yet Binah is Pagum, even though it's a unique halacha just to a particular, right, a particular type of person, a Kohen Gadol. But Zosi Sheisura Shava B'Kol, a Machzir Grushato, applies to any man who divorced his wife and she married someone else in the interim, can't marry this woman again, or any Chai Lavim apply across the board. Okay, so Isurei Lavim that apply across the board to everybody. Eino Din Shebena Pagum, wouldn't you then assume, obviously, the son's going to be disqualified? So if the Almanach can disqualify the son, obviously any of these other women can disqualify the son because there are things that have much wider range of people who they apply to. So the Gemara is now going to raise, so now, what we've done so far is we've seen Rav Yosef, we said in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, that everyone agrees with Machzir Grushato, that the Vlad is disqualified to marry a Kohen. We say, who do we mean everyone? Well, obviously Rabbi Akiva would say so because he thinks the kid's a mamzer. But what we mean here is Rabbi Shimon Atimni, who thinks the Vlad is not a mamzer, would say they can't marry a Kohen, and that's learned out from a Kavachomer from the widow. Now, 3 questions. The order is going to be, right, we're going to do 1, 2, 3. We're going to answer question 3, then we're going to answer question 2, but we're going to be left with question number 1 that we're not going to have an answer for. And because of that, we're going to reread what Rav Yosef says and change the text. So we're going to say there was obviously a mistake in the passing down of this halacha, and we're going to change what he said. So right now we're going to start with our questions. Number 1, we can get rid of this kavachomer. In almanah is much more strict than other things, which means we can't do a kavachomer. We tried to say she's weaker than everything else. She's less strict because it's only unique to one person in the community, to the Kohen Gadol, as opposed to things that apply to everybody. But now we're going to say she's got something unique, which is she herself becomes disqualified. Whereas all these other things, if you're machzir grushato, the woman who was divorced, well, she was anyway disqualified for a Kohen because she was divorced, but not because she was machzir grushato. In other words, the Isur Lav isn't what disqualifies her. Okay, and there's all cases of Isur Lavim. Let's say you're not divorced and you could theoretically marry a Kohen. The fact that you went against and didn't, that one of these Isur Lavim, you married somebody you weren't allowed to marry, wouldn't disqualify you for marrying a Kohen. So that's something more severe that's with an almana, which would make this kavachomer basically disappear. So now, question number 2, ve'od. It says by the machzir grushato, hi to'avaktiv. It says she is despicable. That means she and not someone else. So what do we mean here? Oh, she is despicable. Ve'ein banah to'avim. This has nothing to do with her children. Her children are not part of this picture at all. Okay, it's what she did is disgusting, but it's disgraceful, but it doesn't mess up her children at all. So that would be a drasha that would go against what we just said, because we said her children are disqualified to marry Kohanim, and this seems to say they're not at all. Ve'od Tanya, and third question, there's a braita that says, exactly what we saw in our Mishnah, the 3 cases. Rabbi Akiva Omer, ein lo ba kiddushin. Okay, this is what we call ein kiddushin tofsim. If you marry this woman, your marriage is invalid. Because again, he thinks chayve lavim, marriage is invalid, right? Which would then make the child a mamzer. Einat tzricha imenu get, because the marriage is invalid. You don't even need a get. Okay, you can basically get divorced by him walking away or she walking away because there is no need for a get because you're not actually married. Vehi psula, and she's disqualified. Uvlada pasul, and her offspring is disqualified, right? That means because the vlad's a mamzer. V'kofin oto lahotzi, and we force him to give her a divorce. Okay, what does this mean? We force him to give her a divorce. It means the court issues an order that the husband's supposed to give a get. If the husband doesn't, that's the husband's choice. Okay, the husband still has to give the get willingly, but the court issues, right? Just like we have nowadays, where sometimes someone's not giving a woman a get and he should. So the court can issue and then they can put him in jail and they can do all sorts of things. But in the end, the husband has to give it willingly. So that's what this means here, that we try to force him, but in the end, it's up to him. The Chachamim omrim, the rabbis say, yesh lo ba kiddushin. The kiddushin is valid because it's only chayve lavim, right? Just a regular negative commandment, which is not so strict. We're going to say the marriage is valid. Tzricha imenu get. If she wants to get divorced or he wants to get divorced, he has to give her a get because the marriage is valid. V'hi kshera v'lada kasher. She is kasher and her vlad is kasher. What do you see here? The vlad is totally fine, which sounds like it's not disqualified, right? So liman. What does it mean the vlad is kasher? Lav l'kiuna, does it not mean that the vlad can marry a Kohen? The Gemara says, lo. What does it mean kasher? La kahal. There's 2, we've talked about this before. Either you're a mamzer, you can't marry anyone other than another mamzer or someone in that category, or you're a regular, you're a pasul for marrying a Kohen. So what does this word kasher mean? They assume it means kasher l'kihuna. So then they say, lo. You don't need to say that. In other words, that's not right. Again, this was to raise a question against Rabbi Yosef. It sounds like the child of chayve lavim, according to the rabbis, can marry a Kohen. And that goes against what Rabbi Yosef said. So they say, lo l'kahal. When it says kasher, it means they can marry. They're not a mamzer. That's what it means. So they say, wait a minute. Ihachi, we're going to assume that line, hi kshera, v'uvlada kasher, is talking about the same topic because kasher, kshera, right? It must mean for the same thing. So let's try to plug it in. Hi kshera leman. Now, what does it mean? She is kshera. So, ilem ala kahal pshita. If we're going to say she can marry a Yisraeli, right? A regular Yisrael, because we're saying hu kasher in order to make Rav Yosef work. Hu kasher means tavlad is kasher means can marry a Kohen, right? Which is actually she can marry a Kohen. But right, we're now going to say no. It must be right in order to fit with Rav Yosef, who said she can marry a Kohen. It must be the vlad is kasher lavo b'kahal. okay, but not to marry a Kohen, meaning they can marry Yisrael, they can marry a regular Jew, but not a Kohen. So then he kshera laman. We're now going to say she's kshera to marry anyone, right? A Yisrael, yihachi, kshera laman. Ilema l'kahal pshita. Obviously, she can marry anyone. Nobody's going to call a mamzer because she slept with someone she wasn't supposed to. That's not how you get mamzerim. Mishum dezanya, if so kahal. Well, you would have thought that the Breita needs to tell us she can marry anyone. She doesn't have to only marry a mamzer. Who would have even thought that? Just because she married someone she wasn't supposed to doesn't make her pasul to lakahal. So you wouldn't even need to tell us that. And alav lakuna, you'd have to say it's lakuna. Umidihi lakuna, meaning she's kshera to marry even a kohen. That's what it's telling you. And if that kshera is the kohen, then the Vlada Kasher would be also Vlada Nami Lekihuna, right? The whole assumption of this line of thinking is that her and the Vlad, the Kasher word must be referring to the same thing because it's right next to each other. To which, and then we're going to have a problem with Rabbi Yosef because we're going to assume it means they can both marry Kohanim, in which case Rabbi Yosef can't be right. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Midiria, Hakadita, Hakadita. Who's to say her Kasher and the Vlad Kasher is the same? You could say her Kasher means she can marry a Kohen. The Vlad Kasher means they can marry, they're not a mamzer, okay, but they can't marry a Kohen. So you could say that. And not only do we think you could say that, but Achinami Mistabra, we're going to further prove it from the beginning of the Breita. The Katani Reisha, in the beginning it says, according to Rabbi Akiva, Hi psula uvlada pasul. And in a second, we're going to prove that it has to be, we're talking about two different psulim. One is lekahal and one is to Kohen, because otherwise it won't make any sense. Again, Hi psula leman, so she is disqualified to who? Ilema lekahal. So she's not psula, she's not a mamzer, right? Because that's not how you make mamzerim. Mishum dezanya, if sala lekahal, can't possibly say that. Just because she slept with someone she wasn't supposed to doesn't make her disqualified to marry a regular Jew. So elalav, it must be she's psula means lekihuna, and vlada pasul leman. What's the vlad pasul for? Ilema lekihuna halakahal kasher hamar Rabbi Akiva vlad mamzer. If you say the pasul of the Vlad is to the Kohen, of the Vlad of this relationship, this union can't marry a Kohen, we already know that Rabbi Akiva says there are mamzer, they can't come l'kahal. So therefore it must be elapshita l'kahal umidiresha hakadita v'hakadita sefanami hakadita v'hakadita. Since we split the pasul in the beginning into she's pasul to marry a Kohen, the child is pasul to marry anyone, right? Because the child's a mamzer. Therefore, the kasher at the end is going to be split, and that's how we answer the first question against Rabbi Yosef. So you could still say kasher means kasher lavo b'kahal, but can't marry a Kohen, and that would work okay with Rabbi Yosef. So we had three questions. We answered question number 3. Now we're going back to question number 2. Question number 2 was hito ava nami. You can explain differently that hito ava. We actually saw this before. Hito ava ve'ein sarata toeva aval banea toevi. Hi to'ava could mean to say she is despicable, but not the tzara. Okay, and therefore, right, the tzara, this isn't erva that exempts her tzara, but banea would be still to'avim, and you could still say it goes down to her children. This is just changing the drashas. Yes, it's isolating her as opposed to someone else, but the question is who's the someone else? We could plug in the someone else as the second wife rather than her children. So, but ela almana kashya, but really the question with the almana is still difficult. Okay, so we can't really answer that question because really the almana is more severe, in which case the kavachomer falls. So we're back to square one. How can Rabbi Yosef say that the vlad is pagum l'kiuna? So therefore, ela iyit marhachi, or it must be, we're going to change what Rabbi Yosef said. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Shimon, berebi hakol modim beba achai ve'kritu shavlad pagum. Everyone agrees that if it's chayve karet, the vlad is pagum. Okay, now, man hakol modim, who is this? And it's what's again pagum? Pagum is pagum l'kiuna. Now, we already learned Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim, which is Rabbi Shimon Atimni, all think that the vlad is pagum, is a mamzer, worse than pagum. Pagum means can't marry a kohen. So who do we mean hakol modim? Rabbi Yeshua. Because remember Rabbi Yeshua, even though Rabbi Yeshua said, Emam, afagav dama Rabbi Yeshua, Emam ser mechayve kritut, he doesn't think chayve kritut are mamzerim. Right? Remember, he says only mito beitin. So let's go back to the chayve kritut category. What's he going to say? The vlad is not a mamzer, but the vlad can't marry a kohen, and that's what Rav Yosef is saying. He de mamzer lo have pigum miahave. He is disqualified. Where do we learn this? Mikavachomer me'almana. We're going to learn it. We're going back to the same kavachomer now. Ma mana lekohen gadol she'eni surah shaveh b'kol bina pagum. Zoshi surah shaveh b'kol eno din shebina pagum. So now we're going to learn from her. Since the almana, her son can't marry a kohen gadol, can't marry a kohen at all. Therefore, and hers is not something that applies to all people. Therefore, we're going to take something that applies to all people, which is chayvei krichut, and we're going to say, even though, according to Rabbi Yoshua, the child's not a mamzer, the child can't marry a kohen. And if you want to reject the kal v'chomer like we did on the first reading of Rabbi Yosef, mala manash ken yatzma mitchalelet hachanami kevan sheba'ala asa'a zona. Well, what happens here? Yeah, the almana, since he sleeps with her, she becomes a zona. Also, in the chayvei krichut, if the man sleeps with a woman, he's not allowed to sleep with the chayvei krichut. That's what a zona is, and a zona can't marry a kohen. So she is disqualified in this case of chayvei krichut. So therefore, we work perfectly, just like she's disqualified and the almana is disqualified. They're equal in that way. Therefore, we're going to say, since the almana's kid can't marry a kohen, also this woman's child can't marry a kohen, because this is obviously more severe because chayvei krichut apply to everybody. Everybody can't marry their daughter. Everybody can't marry their brother's wife, etc. So therefore, we're going to say the vlad is pagum in chayvei krichut, even according to Rabbi Yoshua. In other words, according to Rabbi Yoshua, doesn't think the kid's a mamzer, the kid is disqualified for the kuna, and that's how in the end we read Rabbi Yosef. We'll stop here because the next lines go into basically tomorrow's daf, which is what's the status now, which is something we've discussed previously. We'll discuss a lot more now, of a child born from a union of a non-Jew and a Jew. Okay, what's the status of that child? Okay, is the child a mamzer? Is the child not a mamzer? We will see different opinions about that in tomorrow's daf. Have a great day, everyone.